as we continue on with our equilibrium of the national product markets evaluation or analysis, we're going to introduce a new concept. This new concept is the aggregate supply curve. So as we get into the aggregate supply curve, let's first identify what is the aggregate supply. We see the aggregate supply is the nation's aggregate output, the total amount of output, the nation's output, total output as supplied to consumers, businesses, governments, and foreign countries. Basically, how much are we producing? And if you remember back to previous lessons, we know that the aggregate output needs to equal the national income to be in equilibrium of the nation's product market. So that's going to kind of come into play a little bit later as well. So we have, after we identify this aggregate supply, now we're going to create the aggregate supply curve. And with all of these curves, as we talk about in economics, we know that there are a relationship. And in this case, it's showing a relationship between the aggregate output that is being supplied and the range of prices. And another thing that we notice is that it's an upward sloping curve. It slopes upward, and it kind of goes like that, to where as price levels increase, more is being produced. Now, does that make sense? Stop and think about that. The supply curve, it's saying that as prices increase, more is going to be produced. Is that true? Well, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you stop and think about it. What if you own a business? And you might own a business. And if people are willing to pay you more, are you willing to do more work? Well, yeah, because it offsets that additional cost of doing more work. So because of the increase in price level, you're willing to provide more. And even though, and yes, on a micro sense, on an individual business sense, that makes sense. But even for the whole nation, as people are willing to pay more, people are willing to work more, and they're willing to come up with more innovations and spend a little extra money in order to produce more, because that additional price, that increase in price, offsets an increase in cost. So the long story short is, anytime that we have a supply curve, whether it's the aggregate supply curve or any other type of supply curve in economics, specifically when it's dealing with a market supply curve, which is dealing with a specific market, we always have a upward sloping supply curve, which means that as prices increase, quantities are increasing. That's simply because as prices increase, people are willing to produce more. So the next thing we're going to bring in is, how does the aggregate demand play into this? Now, you ought to remember off the last video or the last lesson how the aggregate demand is created. The aggregate demand is created by showing how much are people willing to purchase at a series of alternate prices. So this supply curve, this aggregate supply curve, says how much are people willing to supply at a series of alternate prices, and that generates our supply curve. Now we have this aggregate demand curve that looks something like that. That's saying how much are people willing to buy at a series of alternate prices. And if you remember, we said that one's downward sloping. That is, as prices increase, people are actually going to be buying less. So where those two particular lines intersect, well, that's equilibrium. That's that national products equilibrium point. We'll actually cover that just a little bit more in the next video, I believe. But the thing that we must notice is that as this aggregate demand curve, if it were to increase, if it were to shift outward, if it were to go up in this sense, what happens to price? Well, that equilibrium price now rises. So I want you to stop and think about this as if you were a business, or hopefully maybe you have a business. And if the price increases, are you willing to supply more? Well, yeah, because this aggregate demand increases, it causes price to increase. And because price is increasing, businesses are responding and they're producing more. And what we have is this movement upwards along this supply curve. We have a movement along the supply curve because of the shift in the aggregate demand. On the other hand, what if we have an aggregate demand curve, and then we have a inward shift, a downward shift? we have a aggregate demand decreases for this nation. So if it decreases, if this aggregate demand decreases, what's going to happen to price? Well, prices are going to decrease. Because of lower prices, these businesses are going to respond by producing less. And it causes this downward movement along this demand curve. So, this particular demand curve, or the supply curve, the aggregate supply curve, it's going to have three specific ranges. 1, 2, 3. And on the graphic, you can see it right here on the graph where we have the depression range, we have the normal range, and then we have the classical range of this graph. So what is this depression range? Well, it's dealing with at a place where it's perfectly elastic. And what perfectly elastic means is that we're on this graph, it's going to look like a horizontal line, a straight horizontal line. And what that essentially means is that output can change, but prices will not change. The price level is going to stay the same, but we have a series of alternate outputs at the same price level. That horizontal line is perfectly flat. That is known as perfectly elastic. And what that essentially means is that you can have an increase in demand will increase supply with no changes in price. So if you're down here in that depression range, and let's say you have an aggregate demand of right here, and then you have a shift in that aggregate demand. Aggregate demand increases, but you're still in that depression range. So now we have this new aggregate demand curve, and we see that output is increased. People are producing more. People are buying more, but yet those prices have never changed. There is no impact of inflation in the depression range. Prices will not change as output increases. The next area that we get into is the normal range. That's usually where we're going to find the economy at. And you see the normal range, we have a general price level rise as demand rises. So if we're in this normal range and we draw two aggregate demand curves and we increase that aggregate demand, we see that prices will actually go up as quantity goes up. So within that normal range, we see that those prices are going to increase. Say we move from there to there. We have a small change in prices. But as we move from, say, here to here, we have a large change in prices. So as we're in this normal range, as we move away from the depression range into this classical range, we find that prices, the general price level will rise as demand rises, but it's going to happen very slowly at first. So prices might go from there to there. And then if we jump, and those are two aggregate demand curves, and if we do another aggregate demand curve, we see that prices are going to rise a little bit faster. We come up here, they're rising a lot faster, and all of a sudden we come right here, and they've risen a lot relatively quickly. So it rises slowly at first, but faster as we become more inelastic. In this last range, we have what's known as a classical range. And this is when the economy is at its capacity to supply goods. So down here we see this little Y pot. Well, that stands for Y potential. That's the output potential of the United States. That is the maximum amount of an economy, not even just of the United States. That is the maximum amount that particular economy can produce given its resources. So it's the economy, it's at its capacity to supply these goods. It can't produce anymore. That's the Y potential. That is the total amount. At that point in time, it becomes perfectly inelastic, meaning we got a vertical line on this graph, which means prices can change. But I don't care what the prices are. If you're in this classical range, you're only producing at this Y potential. You can't produce anymore. That's all you can produce. So as demand increases, the prices are going to increase. So if we're going to do this real quick, different demand curves all on here, prices are increasing, and we can see that right here, but yet the amount that we're supplying is staying the same, because that is the total amount, that is the maximum amount that particular economy can produce, and below that or above that, if we try to move further out this way, it's just not physically possible, because we've already maxed out our resources. So those are the three areas of the aggregate supply curve. The depression range that is perfectly elastic, meaning prices will not change, but output will. We have the normal range where both prices and output will change as we move up this curve. Then we have the classical range where the prices don't change, but since we're operating at max capacity, output is going to stay the same.